This is Herman Francis Grills, a schoolmaster, and he was also my father. And he was born towards the end of the 19th century when this song was very popular. She's my lady love, she is my dove, my baby love. She's no girl for sitting down to dream, she's the only queen Laguna knows. I know she likes me, I know she likes me, because she says so. She is my lily of Laguna, she is my lily and my rose. Well, my father was born in 1896, and that was written in 1898 into a Victorian world. And so throughout my life he was rather old for me. I wasn't born until he was nearly 50, and he was born himself in Gainsborough in Lincolnshire, and he got a scholarship to Oxford, and at Oxford he became a tennis half blue. Not only that, he also played for his college in Magdalen in rowing and swimming, and also in boxing, believe it or not. But he had to leave Oxford in his final year. He couldn't afford to stay there because you had to live within a mile of Carfax, and of course living accommodation apart from the college was expensive, and he's surrounded by people who had lots of money. Other students, they would think nothing of driving up to London for parties and things like that, and he couldn't afford that. Anyway, he left and got a job as a teacher temporarily to start with in Nottingham, and he became eventually the head of the English department at Huntingdon Street School. And he had a sort of relatively quiet life, I think. He used to go to music halls and things like that. Probably heard that song, I'm sure. He liked motorbikes as well. He was very keen on motorbikes as a young man. And he was a friend of somebody called George Brough, who made the fantastic Brough Superior motorbike. That's the one Lawrence of Arabia was sadly killed on. And he was also friend of the head of, because he used to do some teaching there at University College Nottingham, as it used to be called, head of the college he knew. That was a chap who was cuckolded by his wife, because she went off with D.H. Lawrence, and of course my father never had much to say about D.H. Lawrence afterwards. He didn't like him, and I think because of that, which is a rather strange thing, is he was a teacher of English. But so he got right through to his mid-30s before he thought of a girl and getting married and that sort of thing. And then he ran into my mother, who at the time was a showgirl. She was only 16. She had just turned 16. She was mid-30s, and she was dancing on the stage and singing Hofer in the West End in Bonjour Paris. And he fell in love with her. He just sort of was bowled over by her, and it was sort of like a Pygmalion affair, where he was Henry Higgins and she was Eliza Doolittle. And it also hit all the buttons, I think, for him, because apart from the love and the sex, there was also fitness. I mean, she was a contortionist as well as a dancer and things. There was obviously the love of music hall, and there was love of teaching. I mean, she lapped up what he had to say about things, about politics and things and so on, and religions and any of this sort of stuff. And anyway, he fell in love with her. Who stole my heart away? Who makes me dream all day? Dreams I know can never come true. Seems as though I'll ever be blue. Who means my happiness? Who would I answer yes? Who would I answer yes? You, no one but you. Who dreams all day. You, no one but you. Well, this girl she wasn't shy, she wasn't melancholic, she wasn't pessimistic. All characteristics he had himself, and he, looking at his, got one or two of his love letters that he sent, and he said that she made the world light up when he walked into a room, that she was like a sort of a tonic, described as like a medical treatment, like a tonic that lifted him up whenever he saw her, and he felt cheerful, and he felt as though he could face the world, and the world wasn't such a bad place after all, which is rather strange because he got a very good job, and she thought it was extraordinary that he would be pessimistic at all, given his job and his status as an Oxford graduate and all this sort of thing. Anyway, when my father decided to marry her, his family were appalled, and they cut him off, and they didn't turn up at the wedding, and they were absolutely couldn't understand what the hell he was playing at. I mean, they thought he was going to be a bachelor throughout his life, and then he found this young girl who was married at 18, she was, and but he had no interest in class at all, none whatsoever, and he decided to trade in his educated family for a ready-made uneducated one. And there was something rather strange after he's got married, and my mother told it many years later, 40 years later, that and it's especially strange for a person who was a committed Christian as he was, and a conventional conservative as well, to say to her, don't ever leave me. You can take lovers. I can understand that as I get older, because you'll find me getting a bit boring, and I can understand it if you do that. Do not forsake me, oh my darling, on this our wedding day. Do not forsake me, oh my darling. Wait alone. I do not know what fate awaits me. I only know I must be brave. I must face the man who hates me. All I a coward, a craven coward, all I a coward in my grave. Well, she didn't take lovers for some time, but it wasn't long after they married, and all his family, then all her family, moved in with him to a house first in Nottingham, and he had his mother-in-law and his sister-in-law and his brother-in-law as well as his wife. So he'd taken on this whole family who weren't educated at all. They left school effectively at 12, my mother and her sister, and but he got a headship then in Newark in Nottingham, which is a pretty market town in about 20 miles away. And it was the church school. It was the school of the parish church, secondary school, and he used the opportunity then to move in to a house which is called 121 Farndon Road, and he wanted to give it upgraded. It had to become a different sort of place, and so he was given the job of finding another name, and he came up with Dane House because my mother's family on her mother's side had come from Denmark, and he also introduced the Bible to them. They knew nothing about the Bible or literature, or anything at all like that, and Mam, as the mother's mother was called, became Mater, Latin. My uncle became a conscientious objector in the war, so he didn't have to go and fight, which my father organised on his behalf for him to say what to say at the tribunal, and he encouraged my mother to go riding. But one of the things he was also was a crossword king, and it was extraordinary really, because in those days crosswords weren't like during the Times or something today where you just did it for your own fun and things like that. There were crossword competitions, quite big things, and you could win prize money, and my father went in for these and he won lots of prizes. In fact, he had to find people with other names to put in, because they said you can't keep you're winning them all the time. His wife went in and even his deputy head teacher. He took his name, one of them. That chap didn't give him the money back, by the way, which is also always rankled. But he was a crossword king, and they asked him if he'd, the newspapers asked him if he'd like to write crosswords professionally himself, and move to London. And my mother thought that was a wonderful idea, but he didn't want to do that. In fact, he didn't like holidays at all very much, although some of the photographs here show him on holiday. But one of the things about his school was that there was no school sport. He introduced that, and which was a big thing. It was a secondary modern school, they didn't have sport. And the other thing he did was he hired artists to teach any creative things, which got him into some trouble with Her Majesty's inspector. His Majesty's inspectors were those come round and they say, well, this person isn't trained, but he trained somebody called Mr. Brannan to teach, who was a practicing artist, showed at the Leicester Galleries in the West End, who lived in Newark and Lincoln, and got him to set up the art department. He said, well, I can't teach. He said, well, I'll teach you to teach, but I can't teach you to be an artist. And it's very sort of like open-minded to do that. And Mr. Brandon, more than anybody else, was responsible for me becoming an artist myself, because when you walked into his classroom, it wasn't like a classroom, it was basically his studio where he's making his paintings and sculptures and things like this. And so you can see things going on, and it was a magical sort of experience to go in there. But the other thing my father did was to cycle out to churches, because being a headmaster of a church school, he would be expected to go and give sermons where the vicars couldn't get round, or the vicar had died, or wherever it was. And so he went out to various churches on Sundays in the villages around Newark to give his sermons, and I was sometimes accompanying him on the back of his bicycle, or sometimes in his old car. And in fact, I made a work about it called Herman's Sermons a few years ago. And his sermons were very elaborate, but they were thoughtful sermons. They were very good, actually. And in fact, I've read a lot of them, and of course I would if I'm making a piece of work about them. And in many ways they're underrated. They probably have a sort of dated feel to them, but there's more thought than you get in many sermons today. Father, like he tends and spares us, all our hopes and fears he knows. In his hands he gently bears us, rescues us from all our foes. Alleluia, alleluia, widely as his mercy flows. One of the things I most admired about my father was his steely will. He'd given 2 fingers to his family to marry my mother, and they'd expressed their disappointment, put it mildly. He did things like he gave up smoking suddenly. He used to smoke 60 a day, and then he just gave up just like that, just extraordinary. Never went back. He always went into school, however ill he was. He could have tonsillitis and flu and anything. He struggled in to school. He had this inner steel, and even when he was old, he broke his back, actually falling off a chair. And he didn't tell my mother. It wasn't until he went into hospital, and in fact it led to his demise, early death, I think. A broken, fractured back, and he went very shrunken towards the end of his life, and that was because he'd done that, but he didn't speak a word about it to anybody. But in 1956, I went to 7 different schools, but the one year the best school I ever went to was his, not just because he was the headmaster. It was a brilliant school, and we had trips to London and a Peak District, and the Christmas Panto was absolutely wonderful. I love the Christmas Panto. And it was also an opportunity for me to get to know him more, because when I came back from Skegness and saw him, I could sort of begin to appreciate his status and his interesting parts, and the fact that there was more to him than he just saw at home. I remember on one occasion, I mean, this is like a Clark Kent moment, this was, it happened when I was there. There was a man who was a voyeur who would come and look over at the children and playing in the playground, and he was asked to move on by the teachers, by my father, and even the police tried to move him on. I think he was arrested at one time, but he came back again, and I think he went to prison at one stage. Anyway, he came back, and one day I was there, and my father had to go and speak to him, and this big man, he took a swing at my father, and my father just sort of floored him, and he did that, he said, by he said, because he was a trained boxer himself, a boxer at the university, he said, I just gave him a left hook to the solar plexus, just like that. And he says, if you do that, know where to do it exactly, the person will be surprised, but they'll also be winded for a couple of minutes or more and just lie. They'll have to go down on the ground to get their breath. They won't be able to get their breath for sometimes they'll be gasping for breath. So that's all that I did with him. But of course, he got lots of kudos, you can imagine, from the boys, particularly, and the teachers. And the other thing he had was introducing sport. He had these tennis competitions. He's very good at tennis himself, and he always, in his later years, he always watched tennis on television, the Wimbledon and so on. But he was almost like a tennis pro. But he had these sort of competitions, these with the teachers, between the teachers. We all went to watch them, and in the summer, and he was sort of prevailed on to come. I think everybody else with tennis whites and things, and he just came out and took his jacket off and played. I remember seeing it. A couple of teachers who were very good on the other side, and he just played himself, and he beat them with one round. And it was because I think not only was he tennis, but he was ambidextrous. He could switch the racket from one hand to the other and just do it very quickly and without moving around, sort of sweatless sort of playing. It's extraordinary. But what was his weakness? Well, the biggest thing that between him and my mother, the arguments, well, they were one-sided really. He said, as she said, he took a book for a drink, and that meant that every night he would go out, whatever the weather, whatever the conditions, at a certain time at 8 o'clock, and on a bus and into the town, and he would and then come back on the 10 o'clock bus or so, and he went out every night for a drink, and mostly he sat reading thrillers. What she said, take a book for a drink, mainly Rex Stout and things like that. And I said to me, she says he reads thrillers because, and I asked him why, being a literature man. He says because I've read all the literature. These are rather strange things to say, but I'd be woken up, and I'm sure my brother did, by these rows in the night when he'd come back. One side, he just heard my mother hysterically shouting at him about his evening drink. That was one of the things that she had against him, and also not taking her out. I mean, she was a party girl. She had been in the shows in Nottingham and London and different things, and he didn't take her out. And sometimes he'd bring out his diary, little diary, pocket diary, and he'd say, we went out to the Theatre Royal in Nottingham on the 23rd of January. And of course she went sort of mental when he said that, because he was regarding it in a very calm way, as though it's like in a court of law reading it out. And of course she was a much more emotional person and volatile, and it sort of was like a red rag to a bull. The other thing that she didn't understand, I think, is because she didn't have a father. Her father was killed in the First World War, and so she didn't get it that not all men did, but a lot of the culture was in those days that men did go out in the evening for a drink, whatever their class. If they're upper class or upper middle class, they went to their club, and if the rest went to a pub. In fact, everybody went to the pub, and men went there to meet other men or sit and talk or on their own, as he did. But it was a sort of like a cultural thing where men and women didn't go out drinking together at all. But in some ways it was part of his escape, because he had made his own bed, but he came to resent his in-laws for the lack of education and the sort of heavy goingness of things with them. And when we were older, he would describe the run-ins, particularly in my mother, using ironic exaggeration to explain my mother's attacks. He would say that he's charged with bogus crimes, that it's a Stalinist show trial and things like that, because he hated anything to do with Stalin and well, certainly communism. That was the other big bête noire of his, was communism. And he would come out with phrases like, canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, equating my mother with Lady Macbeth. Not that it went over the heads, so they didn't know what he was talking about. But as I said, she was like a party girl, and he somehow, he knew he wanted all that excitement, the bubbliness, the champagne of life, but he didn't want to actually partake of it. But he did like his whiskey, and he also liked water with it, and he liked this song. All day I faced a barren waste,
without the taste of water. Cool, clear water, water. Old Dan and I, with throats burnt dry and souls that cry for water. Cool, clear water. Keep her moving, Dan, don't you listen to him, Dan. He's a devil, not a man. He spreads the burning sand with water. Dan, can't you see that big green tree where the water's running free and it's waiting there for me and you? Cool, clear water, water, cool, clear water.
His views were politically polarised. I mean, he was. I remember seeing it first when 1956. It was the year I was at his school, and it was a time of Suez, and he went into a rant about Suez, which was quite took me aback about how we shouldn't kowtow to the Americans, and we should just sort of go in and grab the canal and all the rest of it. You know, the fact that we'd been sort of duplicitously brushed aside, and he said, well, what happened if the Americans went and if somebody tried to seize the Panama and all that sort of thing. And when Khrushchev said he might have to use nuclear weapons if we go in, he said, well, that's what I'd say to him. I say, go ahead then and see what you get in return. And he returned to that same theme in 1962 over the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was rather alarming when he said these things that he thought we should just face up to them and say, ask them to send some rockets over and see what you get back. That sort of thing. Rather alarming for young people. The other thing he supported, right or wrong, and for some reason he didn't like, it was rather strange really, because he didn't like the Arabs for some reason, Arab cultures, which is rather strange because conservatives at that time were very much on the side of the Arabs and the Labour were on the side of Israel. But it was Israel right or wrong for him. They could do no wrong. In that way he was like a modern Christian right in the United States. It was a strange sort of twist to things, but he was absolutely on the ball, and it's part of his the support we had of, as I mentioned before, with a mother of Jewish people, but I think also this thing about Israel standing up to the Arabs and things like that and all that and defeating them, he thought that was wonderful. One of the things he did fear, probably more than anything else, was retirement, because his life was his job. And as he got into his 60s, he started getting much more nervous and beginning to lose his nerves, I heard, walking onto the stage, even going and giving sermons. And so he is prescribed, which they wouldn't do nowadays, sodium amytal, which is a very strong barbiturate and has sort of hallucinogenic effects. It's a dangerous drug. And if you think about that, in taking that and his whiskey and his drinking, it was a sort of a terrible combination. But he did take another job when he retired. He took the job running a small private school run by a Ditzy, owned by a Ditzy woman over in Southall. He did that for a few years. But when he retired completely, and he did used to go and teach at the technical college and was worried about his teaching part-time, he wanted to do that. He became much more melancholic and more drinking with the amateur. It was like a vicious circle, it was. And but he still had that steely will, like for example when he drove over to Southall when he was working over there running the little school in that terrible winter of 1962-63, it was worse since 1947, in a little Standard 8. You go drive over there, whatever the weather. But I suppose he feared obscurity, I think, as well as the loss of job, status and obscurity. And he almost saw obscurity as like a sort of a punishment of God. And I can remember him now when I was in my early 20s, seeing him sitting alone in the evening with his beer and whiskies in the Clinton Arms Hotel in Newark. He had a big, vast empty concourse, which covered glass. He used to when it was built, it was obviously the place where the coaches used to go in, but now it's glassed over. It's a big place, and he was about the only person sitting there, and near a grand piano which was hardly ever played. And he would sit there and he would say things like, "You reel off Shelley" to you. He'd say, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And then he'd look round and he'd pick a drink and say, "Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare." And then he'd gesture to the vast empty concourse of the Clinton Arms Hotel. "Round of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." I mean, the educated would get all these references, but not his family, which is, in a way, it's probably one of his ways of saying things to himself and also to his boys. But it was extraordinary to equate the demise of the Egyptian Empire and the British Empire at Suez with his own impending demise, and it was all rather glum, really. Anyway, he was a lovely man, and he wouldn't hurt you at all. He was a very supportive. Oh, my papa, to me he was so wonderful. Oh, my papa, to me he was so good. No one could be so gentle and so lovable. Oh, my papa, he always understood. He did, actually. He did always understand. One of the other things that my mother didn't like, and in ways you could see that, he never corrected us. And he said they were just children if we were playing up. And my mother felt that, I mean, she was bringing them up on her own, she felt. He sort of took a back seat in that. But as I say, he was a very loving father. But the thing I miss most of all is that, as I said at the beginning, I wished I was older when he was in his pomp. I mean, he's nearly 50 years older than me. I wish I'd known him when he was. I knew him better when he was over the hill and on the downward track. But I don't know, the sculpture of Ozymandias in the desert, with the desert stretching as far as it can see, his broken sculpture, and seeing himself like that. But I think, coming back to the beginning, that Pygmalion is a better sculpture and nearer to him and his life. The man who made a sculpture of a beautiful woman and it sprang to life and took him over, became his wife. I mean, he knew my mother would grow up and take him over. He must have known that. I mean, he did say about he could understand how she took lovers. I mean, he alone had decided to exchange his own family for his wife's, nearly once putting his foot down when he retired and said he didn't want all the in-laws living with him, and from now he just wanted to be with his wife and children. And in fact, they obeyed. So when he put his foot down, they did what they were told. But that's the only time I can remember. But I think he alone created his own capture, because that is what he wanted, to be the boss at work only. I think that's what it was. He wanted to switch off from being the boss. And by the way, talking about that, and we're going to look at it in a minute, is I've got my own Pygmalion sculpture by my older art school tutor, so we'll take a look at that in a minute. But in the meantime, I just want to say thanks for watching. This is the last episode of this season. If you did want me to do any more in this lockdown continues, we don't know, let me know. I want to thank you all for the private letters and things and little emails and things you've sent me, and for watching these things. But anyway, let's finish with this. If it starts, there it goes.